Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to lawcaseuk.com. Today I'm going to be looking at the UK Supreme Court decision in Lee and Asher's Baking Company Limited. Now this is a case that generally falls under the heading of discrimination. But before I start under that heading, I should say that there is also a second aspect to the case. This second aspect is an administrative law aspect, and it arises from a finality clause that exists in the County Court Northern Ireland Order of 1980. And the first question that the court had to ask was whether it had jurisdiction at all to decide the matter that was under contention. But that aspect I'm not going to deal with today. I'm going to focus purely on the first aspect, that of discrimination. It was this aspect that caught the attention of the media, and the case often appeared under headlines such as gay cake or gay wedding cake. And without wishing to be flippant, one of the first areas I want to explore is what qualifies a cake to be labelled in that way, at least in the media. Is a cake labelled as gay because the person that orders it is gay? Is it labelled gay because the cake will be used in some way associated with the LGBT community, such as gay marriage? Or in a third scenario, is the cake gay because overtly it demonstrates something that supports an LGBT issue, such as support for gay marriage? And that's what we face in the present case. Now, I ask these questions because understanding the answer to that question may understand firstly whether there's discrimination, but secondly, and this is the key case, or the key question in our present case, is whether there's discrimination that can be justified. So for example, in the first of the three scenarios that I gave you, where somebody who supplies goods or services refuses to do so just because the customer is gay, then that is an example of discrimination, and it's a type of discrimination that can never be justified, and therefore the law steps in to protect the rights of the LGBT community in that type of scenario. And if you want a case that does that, you can have a look at the 2013 Supreme Court case of Bull and Hall. But what we have in Lee and Asher's Bakery is a slightly more nuanced question to decide. So the baker does not refuse to supply the cake just because the customer is gay. So let's have a look at the facts in the case. Here the appellants, the bakers, are the MacArthurs, and they run a bakery in Northern Ireland called Asher's, and they are Christians, and the name of their shop comes from the Bible, from Genesis 49:20, where it says, "Bread from Asher shall be rich, and he shall yield royal dainties." Now, the MacArthurs believe that the only form of marriage that's consistent with their beliefs is that between a man and a woman. And of course there are others in Northern Ireland that believe the same, but at the same time there are others in Northern Ireland who do not hold those views. But moving on to the other party in the case, that is Mr. Lee. He's a gay man who volunteers with an LGBT organisation known as Queerspace. Now this organisation supports the campaign for same-sex marriage in Northern Ireland, and bear in mind Northern Ireland is the only country in the UK where same-sex marriage is not legally possible, and therefore there is understandably a campaign to change the law in that respect. So it's proper to refer to it as a campaign, and that becomes quite important later on. Now Mr. Lee was invited to attend a function at this organisation, Queerspace, and he decided to take, guess what, a cake to the function. So he went to Asher's Bakery, ordered a cake from their Build a Cake service, a bespoke baking service, and he asked for the cake to be decorated with an image which contained two male puppet characters from Sesame Street, Bert and Ernie, and importantly, together with that picture was a slogan that said, "Support gay marriage." Now Mrs. MacArthur took the order, and initially she accepted it. She, in her evidence, said that she did so in order to avoid any embarrassment to Mr. Lee. But once Mrs. MacArthur had had a time to think and speak with her family on the issue, it was decided that the bakery could not perform the order because it would conflict with their religious beliefs. Mr. Lee was telephoned and informed of this, and in particular, and this is, I think is quite important, that they could not fulfill the order as they could not print the slogan that was requested. Now, Mr. Lee, as a result, complained to the Equality Commission for Northern Ireland, and they supported him in these legal proceedings. And these legal proceedings are based on two grounds of discrimination that I'll take in turn in due course. But for now, at first instance, Mr. Lee was successful and the MacArthurs were ordered to pay £500 in damages. As a result, they appealed to the Northern Ireland Court of Appeal, and they lost the case there as well. But they then appealed to the UK Supreme Court, where they were successful. As an interesting aside, the UK Supreme Court went to Northern Ireland to hear argument, and this is only the second time that they have sat outside of their London home. But going back to the legal grounds upon which Mr. Lee based his claim, there were two. Firstly, that he'd been discriminated on because of his sexual orientation, and secondly, he'd been discriminated against because of his political beliefs. Now, the court was unanimous in its decision in the case, and there was a single judgment which was delivered by Lady Hale. And I'll look at the judgment in relation to the grounds of discrimination and begin with that of sexual orientation. Now, here the court dealt with matters relatively succinctly. They held that there was no discrimination within the relevant regulations because the MacArthur's objection was to the message that was going to be put on the cake and not to any particular person. And therefore, the objection was not to the orientation of Mr. Lee. And importantly, the court suggested that heterosexual people could also support gay marriage and could order such a cake. And if they did, then they would be denied a cake in the same way that Mr. Lee had been. So there was no discrimination that was based on sexual orientation. In particular, here Lady Hale had to say this: "It is deeply humiliating and an affront to human dignity to deny someone a service because of that person's race, gender, disability, sexual orientation, or any of the other protected personal characteristics. But that is not what happened in this case, and it does the project of equal treatment no favours to seek to extend it beyond its proper scope." And in this last point, she seems to imply a criticism of the complaint that is raised and then proceeded with. So no sexual discrimination. It had nothing to do with Mr. Lee's orientation. A straight person ordering such a cake would have been treated the same. Perhaps from this point, the cake becomes not the gay cake, but the political cake, because the remaining ground is that Mr. Lee's been discriminated on the basis of his political beliefs. Now, this arises from law that is peculiar to Northern Ireland, whereas the sexual orientation claim would be common across the United Kingdom. Now, here the claim proceeded slightly differently. Once again, it would be wrong for someone to refuse goods or services on a discriminatory basis. This time the additional ground is the political beliefs of the person ordering the goods or services. But here the court first looked at gay marriage and decided, well, this was capable of being a political belief. Support for gay marriage was a campaign, as I've already said, in Northern Ireland, and whether gay marriage should be legalised was a matter that had been debated a number of times by the Northern Ireland Assembly in recent years. So it was a political issue. The court then said that there was, therefore, an argument that Mr. Lee had been discriminated against because of the close association between the message that appeared on the cake and his own political views. Unlike the sexual orientation claim, where the court decided that anyone could support gay marriage, in terms of political beliefs, only those that supported gay marriage were likely to seek a slogan. So, in effect, looking at the case as a whole, what the court said was, just because Mr. Lee ordered a cake that said support gay marriage did not necessarily mean that he would be perceived as gay, the sexual orientation claim. But it was more likely that if he ordered such a cake, he would be perceived as supporting, as a political belief, gay marriage. And therefore there was a much closer association between the message and his political beliefs than there was between the message and his sexual orientation. Now, the court did say they still had some doubts about that, but they were prepared to proceed on the basis that there might be discrimination. Having reached that conclusion, the question then became whether there was any justification on the MacArthur's part for their refusal to bake the cake. And here the question became, did they have any rights under the European Convention of Human Rights which would justify their refusal to supply the cake? Now, the convention rights engaged here are, of course, Article 9, the right to freedom of thought, conscience and religion. And here, the European Court of Human Rights has held in the case of Buscarini and San Marino that it would also be a breach of this article to oblige a person to manifest a belief that they did not hold. So it's not just the freedom to have thought and conscience, but also the freedom not to manifest something that you don't believe. And an example is the requiring a non-believer to swear a Christian oath before they could become a member of Parliament. That would offend the Article 9 right. Now, the case also involved Article 10, which protects freedom of expression. And once again, while the article does not expressly include the right not to express an opinion, the courts have held that it does by implication. And in particular on this point, you can see the case of RT Zimbabwe and the Secretary of State for the Home Office. Now, because of these two articles, the court decided it would be wrong for the law to compel the MacArthurs to express a message with which they disagreed. Whether they became associated with that message or not, they should not be have to express a message that they did not themselves believe. Now, in the US, this notion is called compelled speech, and Mr. Lee's representatives did try to distinguish this notion as being external to the UK jurisdiction and being something that was found within US law, but the court didn't find favour with that because of the European Court of Human Rights cases that I've already cited. So they found this notion is present within European and therefore domestic jurisprudence. In particular, on this occasion, in relation to the political beliefs claim, Lady Hale said, "There is not justification for," and here I begin the quote, "obliging them to supply a cake iced with a message with which they profoundly disagreed. In my view, they would be entitled to refuse to do that, whatever the message conveyed by the icing on the cake. Support for living in sin, support for a political party, support for a particular religious denomination." So all sorts of messages they might be entitled to refuse to put on a cake. So going back to where I started with those three crude categories about how a cake might be classified, the law can penalise the MacArthurs for not supplying goods or services to Mr. Lee because he is gay, but it cannot penalise them for refusing to endorse a message that contradicts their own beliefs. Now, the case in the United Kingdom Supreme Court became about this message rather than about the man or the cake, and this was the key statement from Lady Hale in the case, where she said, "The objection was to being required to promote the message on the cake. The less favourable treatment was afforded to the message, not the man." And this second sentence then became the media headline for the case, for example, on Sky News, which said, "Gay cake, it was about the message, not the man."